Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven, and I am your host for today. We've got a fun show planned for you guys, talking about ESPN's positional rankings. I have to clarify before we start that it's not actually their rankings. Jeremy Fowler surveys people around the league, and so blame AFC and NFC executives, scouts, players, all that good stuff. But we'll dive into some of that, and then we're going to do a pre-training camp stock down, we are just a few weeks away, so lots of pre-training camp stuff to talk about. I'm really excited to discuss that today with my guys, Tyler and Alex. Alex, we'll start with you, man. How are you doing tonight?
Doing good.
Cool. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing? And hope your fiance is doing well from her recovery and everything else going on there.
Yes, I'm doing very well. Both of my knees are functioning and working very well. She's currently on 1.05 good knees, but we are getting there. She started physical therapy today. That ACL is going to come back, no problem. Hope it works out.
Yeah, she'll be surfing again in no time. So, like I mentioned, we're going to have some good conversations today, talking about the ESPN list, talking about some pre-training camp stuff. And we'll dive right into the specific ESPN rankings. So, as of now, the every single position has been released except for offensive tackle. Of course, Joey Bosa kicked it off for the Chargers and was the fourth highest rated edge rusher, if you will, which I need mainstream media to just adapt that mantra, that specific tag. I saw an NFL Network graphic that had Khalil Mack as a linebacker and Randy Gregory as a defensive end, and they play the same position in the same scheme. So I need edge rusher as the official tag. JC Jackson was the fifth highest ranked corner. Derwin James, the fourth highest ranked safety. Justin Herbert was the seventh highest quarterback. Austin Eckler was an honorable mention, which is my name today, Austin Eckler snubbed. And then both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams mentioned today as honorable mentions as well. Keenan Allen was the first honorable mention. Mike Williams was the last honorable mention. So he was 17th technically. I guess I haven't done tight ends, but I don't expect Gerald Everett to be in there either. We'll see where Rashawn Slater ends up. So Tyler, we'll start with you. As it relates to the Chargers, what's your first takeaway from where they ended up at in these Jeremy Fowler annual survey rankings, if you will?
I guess overall, it's great to see that this team is so talented and so respected. Like, you didn't have to include some of these guys on there. Sure. Would I want Corey Linsley higher? Sure. Would I want Derwin James higher? Yeah. But, you know, a lot of really good talent, some new talent. I'm surprised.
I can't believe I forgot about Lindsey. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I got you. Don't worry.
Thank you.
I did draft him in our draft, so maybe like he's part of my team. I'm surprised. I guess I don't know where Mac would have been, but I guess I am still a little surprised that he is ninth. He does hold that much weight after really not being much of himself last year because he just couldn't be on the field, but still great to see. The wide receivers, I think a lot of people talk about Herbert, you know, where he could be whatever. I think the wide receiver one is both interesting but not surprising. It's interesting to see that, you know, both these guys were mentioned. I think we all generally view these guys right about, you know, I think you had him ninth, Keenan Allen ninth in your top 10. I would have had him in like that 8 to 10 range. Alex had him outside the top 10, but very close. But it's still good to see them there. The biggest one that I hate the most really is Austin Eckler's. And I don't understand why someone like Javonte Williams or Najee Harris would be over him at this point. I think if you go to next year, then maybe you could have those guys over Austin Eckler. But Eckler, we haven't done the running back rankings that we were kind of leading into that. Maybe we'll never get to it. But just whereas like Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, let's just talk about Keenan Allen. Like on film, I think he's a top 10 wide receiver. But I can't say the same thing for him statistically. Sure. Austin Eckler, on film, looks fantastic. Runner, receiver, whatever, third down player, you name it. But the stats also point to a guy who's sixth most scrimmage yards in the league last year, 20 touchdowns. And that's good enough for an honorable mention behind Najee at his 3.6 yards per carry or whatever it was. That was the only real big like surprise snub for me that didn't get into the top 10. Otherwise, I'm just happy to see that there's so many talented players that are respected around the league on this team this year.
Yeah, the Austin Eckler one is weird because it almost feels like they processed it as who are the best runners list as opposed to running backs, right? Having Javonte as high as they did, Najee as high as they did. So, but it's also like the guy was, free catching the ball, had 20 touchdowns. Like, how do you leave him out of the top 10? I do think that's the most egregious snub, but that also corresponds with a little bit what we saw with the Pro Bowl voting, right? Eckler somehow not making the Pro Bowl in the AFC alone, and that was a weird thing. But I guess that kind of is, backs up the, what the perception around the league of him is, which is like you're kind of the, he was the first honorable mention, right? So they kind of view him as like the 11th best running back, but it's like Saquon and Zeke were in the honorable mention category as well. And I think Austin Eckler's production far outpaces what any of them have done in recent years. So I thought he was a pretty egregious snub. Should have been somewhere definitely in the 6 to 10 range. The interesting thing on these lists was like which lists are more a factor of like recency bias versus which ones just kind of stick to like the old tactics, because it's kind of a combination of both, right? Mm-hmm. You sort of see someone like Jamar Chase get number 3 on the wide receiver lists, but they also kind of give credence to like, okay, DeAndre Hopkins didn't have the best year last year, was hurt, but we're still going to put him at 7 or 8 because of what he's done before. Same with Khalil Mack, even on the edge list, even though he didn't play last year, still having him as the 9th best edge rusher in the league, even though he didn't finish the season. So a weird combination of things. And I just don't get the perception of like playoff games and looking at a limited sample size for the quarterbacks. I know that is like what they do, and I'm not terribly surprised by it. But I'm also just like the best thing. It would have been fine if they ranked Joe Burrow at like number 5, and the explanation for it was, he just had a really efficient year, and we decided to put him there. But like their explanation for it was he took a lot of sacks in the Titans game. I'm like, what? Yeah. We just saw him really grit it out here. I'm like, what are we doing?
So tough.
Like, was this article just written by was this survey done by 70 David Gettlemans, and we just put all these football guys in a room? Like, I don't know. I personally would have put Herbert higher, but I just don't understand the fixation of quarterbacks and playoff resume when they don't really particularly value that for any other position, even though obviously having a high-profile edge rusher, having a high-profile receiver makes you a contender as well. So I think they do overvalue it for quarterback on these lists. But in general, I didn't have a huge problem with any of the lists. I thought Eckler was certainly snubbed. And I think Herbert should have been higher. Derwin, it could be argued that he should be higher than 4, but I think they almost view that as like a health thing and how much you can rely on that. So I kind of understood why he was at 4. I'm going to be curious to see the offensive tackle rankings to see exactly where they put Rashawn Slater because, Steven has been banging the drum of top 3 tackle all off season. I think he'll be a little bit lower than 3, but I'd like to see him certainly in that 6 to 10 range and be there as well. So I'll be curious to see how they do that as well as the tight ends.
Yeah, to be clear, it's been the top 3 left tackle specifically. I think. Yeah, if you include Tristan Wirfs and Ryan Ramczyk, I think you can put Sean Slater a little bit lower, and I'm okay with that one. Getting back to the Austin Eckler thing first and foremost, it's a weird list to me. Like specifically the running backs, I definitely got the vibe that it was like, okay, here's the best runners. Like these are the best pure runners in the league. But then it was like Christian McCaffrey was listed, and everything they talked about was his ability as a pass catcher. And same thing with Alvin Kamara. And then with Austin Eckler, it's like he has a feel for the passing game. It's like, the hell are we watching here? Austin Eckler has the most catches, yards, and touchdowns as a receiver among every running back in the league over the last 3 years. And that includes missing 9 games last year with a torn hamstring, or 2020, I should say. So it just didn't make any sense to me. I agree that Austin Eckler is not like a top 10 runner. Like I think there are other running backs that, are better pure carriers of the football, right? Like I think you could talk about, Josh Jacobs being like a better pure runner than him. And I think that's a fine conversation to have. Elijah Mitchell had 1,200 yards for the Niners last year. I think that's fine.
Mhm.
But we're at a point in the sport where if you can't catch the ball as a running back, you have zero value. And so like these same executives tell us financially that if you're just a runner, you don't have as much value as somebody who can also catch the
good
ball.
point.
But then in the rankings, they're like, oh, well, the guy who is a pass catcher who's really good at it, we're going to put him in the honorable mention category. So I don't know. That was really frustrating for me to see that happen. And specifically after last year, like it was, if it was 2020 and they had listened to honorable mention, I don't think I would have had as much of an issue. But among all running backs, he was third in scrimmage yards, and he was tied for first in touchdowns with Jonathan Taylor, who people tried to give MVP votes to last year.
Right.
So that one was frustrating to me. That was the biggest frustration of the list, at least for the Chargers and their perspective. But again, if Rashawn Slater is outside of the top 8 tomorrow, I'm going to be pissed. That will be the biggest one that I will be most upset about.
Yeah, I thought that just having McCaffrey at 7 was a weird one because it's kind of like you want to give him, credence for what he's done in his career, but he's also played 10 out of his last 33 possible games and has had, declining production across the board. So it's like, yeah, on one hand, you want to blame that on the Carolina offense because it's the Carolina offense. But I feel like you just kind of, that's the spot I would have put Eckler in. I would have put Eckler at like the number 7 spot. Could have put him 8, 9, or 10 for me. But leaving him off the list entirely was just a bit too much for me.
You really think Everett doesn't make the top 10? Not that I would be surprised, but like, okay, who are the 10?
I don't think he makes the top 10, man. I think. Let me pull up these.
Well, I guess
I got to look at the numbers for this one.
We're taking Gronk out of the top 10 because he's retired.
That's true.
So that opens up a spot.
It's definitely Kittle, Waller, Kelsey, Pitts is definitely going to make it.
Andrews will make it.
Schultz
will make it. Dallas Goedert will make it. Mike Gesicki will make it. Was that Ertz, 8 already?
Ertz, that's 8. Probably on the back end.
I could see it. That wouldn't surprise me. I would imagine there's a lot of Dawson Knox fans after he had 600 yards and 10 touchdowns last year. Maybe Hunter Henry sneaks in there, 600 yards, 9 touchdowns last year.
Yeah, I can see that.
TJ Hawkinson has a lot of fans, although he was injured a lot last year.
I think Everett's ceiling is probably like honorable mention between 12 and 15.
Okay, he doesn't
around there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, more tight ends than I thought.
Yeah. The position's getting better, which is good to see for a fan of the position and also just like a guy who plays fantasy football. Like it's great to see not just like 2 good tight ends and then everybody else is trash. So Zach Ertz had 784 yards last year, which is a little bit surprising.
Yeah, I think I feel like these rankings do reveal how deep these positions are around the league because running back, it's like you're really like looking for names. And like Steven said, when we were talking about this in the chat earlier, it also tells you that like running backs are kind of expendable now, right? Yeah, a lot of teams run running back by committee and just have like 2 or 3 guys that they use at a time. And so that's why each running back is a little bit less important, except for like Derrick Henry and Tennessee, obviously. So that I didn't mind as much in terms of like, their explanations for those. And also just the running back quality around the league right now isn't great. And you're relying on a lot of like, kind of players with old seasons in the past, like Saquon, like Zeke. But yeah, wide receiver is super deep around the league. And I didn't take anything away from them from not putting Keenan Allen in that top 10 because it's just, and they didn't even put, Terry or CD or some of the guys we talked about on our top 10 list in there. And they were just honorable mentions. So, AJ Brown as well. So for those guys to not make the top 10 list, but then you get this total youth infusion all across the list. It's just like, that's the deepest position in the league by far.
Yeah. I mean, we had very different lists for the wide receiver rankings and I'm fine with Keenan Allen being 11th. Like, I think that's totally fair if he's in, the 8 to 12 range for people. I think that's fair. And obviously, the statistical limitations would have him, be in that same kind of category. Like we're talking about, other players who are, constantly getting, 1,300 yards, 11, 12 touchdowns versus Keenan, who's getting, just over 1,000 and right at 6 touchdowns. So obviously we've all been wanting more statistics from him, but Yeah, I have no issues with that. I was pretty surprised, honestly, that Mike Williams got honorable mention because of all those guys that Alex is mentioning. That all these young guys that have really come in. So that was good to see, right? Like I think Mike Williams getting that kind of respect is good to see around the league.
Yep, absolutely.
SoCal Slime with a super chat question. How will Steven react if they have Colton Miller over Rashawn Slater in the offensive tackle rankings? I'm going to be livid. Like I will be so mad. Like I think, I just watched the first Raiders game, and obviously we've watched Colton Miller a lot. And I think Colton Miller is a very good offensive tackle. Like I do think he is very good. But there's no question to me that Rashawn Slater is already a better player than Colton Miller as a rookie. He was second team All-Pro. Which is crazy if you look at the history of playing left tackle in this league. I mean, like, look at all of the recent draftees who have been, starting left tackles as rookies, and they all were like bottom of the league in pressures allowed, bottom of the league in pass blocking efficiency. And Rashawn Slater comes in right away and is that dude. So, and according to Duke Manyweather, is the most improved tackle in the league. So, if Rashawn Slater is outside of the top 8, I am going to be pissed tomorrow. Or is that Thursday, I guess, or Friday? I don't know. Whenever those
tackle specified. Yeah, I mean the numbers aren't like super dissimilar, but no, I just think that Miller, I would think, would get knocked just for being on the Raiders line, which wasn't that great. Not that that's his fault, but
bad.
voting just kind of goes that way, And Slater was on a much improved line. He was second team All-Pro. I think he'll be over Miller, but.
I wouldn't be surprised. Colton Miller made the playoffs and Rashawn Slater didn't, and that seems to be the only thing that matters on these lists. So
that is so true. I was talking on every single Wednesday morning. I do an appearance on the local ESPN radio channel here, and we were talking about the quarterback ranking specifically and how it's like instead of like wins and like postseason appearances being like the tiebreaker. It's like the consensus is like, this is what we're going to start our argument with. And so it's like, by default, you have to put Stafford over Herbert because he won the Super Bowl and Burrow over Herbert because he went to the Super Bowl. And it's like, if you really feel like those three players are on an equal footing and that's your tiebreaker, like, I hate that, but I would understand that more than just it being like the very start of your argument, which is what it seems to be like. And, I thought that was just a casual fan thing. Apparently that's an NFL executive thing as well. So it's just a little frustrating for
I'm not surprised.
Like Justin Herbert.
And we've heard like NFL executives call Burrow the next Brady, plenty of times before. So I'm like not surprised that he's football guy in that way. But it does make me cringe. It's like, we have 17 games of sample size that you guys could watch. You clearly didn't. Yeah. I don't think any of them watched a single snap of another quarterback that wasn't on their team. But you have all this sample and data you could use, and you choose the 3 or 4 game sample size over the 17 game one, which just makes me cringe, but that is what it is.
Yeah, then they choose the sample size, and I'm sorry to be bringing up Burrow because I feel like we do that a lot, but like it's a big one. Like, yeah, he won the games, but look at the numbers in the games. You can't throw 2 touchdowns in 3 games and say you led your team to the that just come on, man. Like overcoming a defense is like Herbert versus the Bucks or something in 2020, whereas like he scored like 4 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, and overcame and fought back versus a very good defense. Scoring 1 touchdown, per game is not overcoming a defense. That's surviving, and that doesn't really put somebody in the over another person, I don't think.
And it's also kind of like Steven said, you almost want to use playoffs as like a tiebreaker, right? Like if you have these guys really close together, or even if you're looking at someone like Josh Allen, who slid towards the back half of last season and then goes supernova in those 2 playoff games and has 9 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, like, that was like, okay, well, my biases said he slid a little bit in the rankings, but now he's clearly back up because he had those 2 playoff games, right? I think we could talk about that, but it's just very clear that if they did this survey after the regular season versus after the postseason, the results would just be completely different. And for that to be the case is just, it makes almost a 17 game sample size, useless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then of course the whole Deshaun Watson thing, it's like, why? If you just take like him, his legal situation aside, he didn't play a single game last year. And
Yeah.
in 2020, his team won 4 games. Like, these executives are all talking about win-loss record mattering so much. It's like we've seen him win 4 games in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing here?
The win-loss also doesn't matter. Name is Lamar Jackson, and you've won the third most games in the last 4 years, aside from Brady and Mahomes. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, Lamar Jackson literally broke a record for most wins in your first 3 seasons, and that includes him not starting for the first half of his rookie season. So that's always fun. All right, Tyler, any final thoughts as it pertains to the ESPN rankings?
No final thoughts. Just hope the entire team gets in there next year. And in particular, I'm really hoping there's some honorable mention at least for linebacker or defensive tackle. Because it's a bit rough to be scrolling through there and seeing that 2 first-round picks were not on that list.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, any final thoughts on the ESPN list?
Nope.
All right. Sounds good. Before we move on, I want to give a quick shout out to Brent Kincaid for the Super Chat sticker. Apparently, he's from the Central Valley. I live in the Central Valley as well, so always good to see that. And then there was another one earlier.
One here from Fat Man versus Trail. Fat Man versus Trail. That sounds like every December when I go to Big Bear.
That sounds like an early 2000s like ska band name or whatever it's called.
Fat Man versus Trail sounds like me last fall.
It's true. You have lost a lot of weight, so props to you for that. I thought I saw another one. Oh, it was the same guy. Okay. He wants to know really quickly who has a bigger season for the Chargers this year, Van Noy or Sebastian Joseph Day. I think for me that would be Sebastian Joseph Day. I think he is the DT1 on the team, if you will. He's the leader of that group. He is going to play the most snaps in that group. So I'm really excited to see him take that leap forward and not just be looked at as a run defender, because I think he is underrated as a pass rusher. So I'll take Sebastian Joseph Day there for sure.
Yeah, I agree there. Unless you're looking at production, like, sure, I'm sure Van Noy can put up some production, but as a bigger season and importance, yeah, easily Sebastian Joseph Day.
Yep.
Hello, Dad. Thank you for the super sticker. Amazing. Thank you.
There we go. So Shun family always well represented in our show. So we're going to move on now and talk about our pre-training camp stock up, stock down. Of course, we have to start with the bit of information I got about Trey Pipkins earlier today. So I reached out to somebody who attended the offensive line masterminds that happened in Dallas this past weekend. He was in attendance. Has a bit of a working relationship with Duke Manyweather as well. I don't want to give too much away. But here's basically what I have to say about him and some specific quotes about him. So one of his thoughts there, and he said, quote, Trey has had a fantastic offseason. He's been working really hard with Duke, and they've made some great progress with his strength and technique. He looks better than ever, and he's been a constant sponge with the trainers and the vets, which you always like to see, end quote. So the being the sponge part is not new information, right? Like Daniel Popper did a great profile on Trey Pipkins recently. And in the article, Trey mentioned that, he's had a great time working alongside Teron Armstead and those guys, and just being able to, pick their brains a little bit. So wanted to follow up with specifically what's kind of been the focus for Duke and Trey. And he said, quote, hand placement is always the focus with Duke. He tries to figure out what works best for each player and then amplify those strengths. Trey has had a lot of struggles and inconsistencies with this that should be much improved now after working down here, end quote. And I do definitely agree with that it has been a big issue for Trey, specifically with, his performances against pass rushers. Anytime somebody gives him a counter, he has no answer for it. He kind of lunges a little bit too much. And then in the run game, we've seen some issues there as well. Finally, to get his final thought there, and specifically like physically, like what kind of benefits, what kind of advantages will being in better shape provide Trey Pipkins. And he said, quote, he's definitely gotten stronger down here, and the improved technique should allow him to anchor down better and execute the more physical blocks in the run game at a higher level. I assume that means like, combo blocks, pulling, stuff like that. Trey has always been a good athlete, but has had a problem with false stepping that Duke has really been working hard with him. If he takes it to the field, he should be more explosive out of his stance. So again, those are kind of issues that I have seen from Trey Pipkins. Really not being able to use his athletic traits at the highest level, not necessarily being able to anchor down against pass rushers. And this source seems to think that all of those issues, I don't want to say solved, right? Because we haven't seen it, but he is improving in those regards. And my guy thinks that that Trey Pipkins will absolutely be starting week 1 if he's able to kind of take advantage, take everything he learned from Duke and put it onto the field. So this is our first stock up, stock down. What are you guys buying? What are you guys selling from this conversation, Daniel Popper's conversation, Duke calling him a most improved player? Anything you want to go there is obviously fair game.
I have to at least buy it. I have to buy that there is improvement and that he has improved these things. Duke Manyweather, talks about, like, on Brendan Thorne's podcast, it's not necessarily fixing weaknesses as much as it is amplifying strength. So it's great to hear that, some things that he's good at, he's just going to get really good at and get much better at that. And then just watching offensive line masterminds, the little background, the little info they have and the videos, just all the testing they have, the data, the film, the rehab, the physical therapist, everything. It is such a great place for linemen to go. I would imagine it's heaven for them. And, Steven, you've coached, I've coached. Sometimes it just takes a coach to change an athlete, what they can do, their perspective, and it could be so simple. Someone just explains it. It could just be a different perspective, someone explaining it differently. And for him to go down there and improve like he has, again, like Duke said, like Duke didn't need to say that Trey Pipkins was one of the most improved players, that he had, but he mentioned him. If he wants to go out there and advertise, he'd say maybe, a more popular name. It's freaking, he picked Trey Pipkins, and Rashawn Slater, of course, but he picked Trey Pipkins, and I absolutely have to believe him. And it just goes back to, March 15th, we even heard that they were high on Trey Pipkins, and that's from a defensive player on the team. So you have, I'm sure the chat can figure out who your person is. It wouldn't be hard to figure out, but it's rough to say this. It's feeling like the Kaiser White situation where you hear enough things from, reporters say this person says that, another person says that. Everything is pointing at Trey Pipkins at least being the starter, but also just being better. And I don't know if that's fantastic. I don't believe it for 1 second. It's Rashawn Slater level by any means, but listen, I'll take it. If it's slightly below average, that's an improvement. If it's average, that's a huge improvement. And I'll take that. The Chargers, have believed in him. It seems, obviously Norton is currently the starter, and I believe he was taking snaps with the ones at minicamp.
Yeah.
But that seems like it's going to change. Like, Pipkins has the mindset. He's going to the right places. He's in the right spot. He's trending up. Stock up. And I do buy that he has at least improved, and I'm excited for it.
Yeah. Before Alex jumps in really quickly, couple questions in the chat. So if you don't follow Duke Manyweather, he trains about 50 players or so throughout the offseason that he works with. Obviously, not all of them are offensive tackles specifically, but there are guards down there. There are centers down there. And we've seen really how big the offensive line masterminds has gotten. I mean, the Draft Network was down there this time. There were hundreds of players at the NFL level, college level, some high school, I think I saw as well. So, Duke saying that Trey Pipkins is the most improved player that he works with, like, among others, right? I think he listed 5 players total, but, that I think will hold some weight. But again, like, Duke will go to bat for his guys. And as always, like, you take off-season workout hype with a grain of salt, right? Until you see it in person.
Sure.
There was some very positive stories written about Trey in 2020, during COVID, about how he was leaning down and taking it seriously, and then it didn't work out. So I'm hopeful. Like, this isn't necessarily like swinging me in any direction by any means, but I think my favorite thing here is that Trey went out of his way to go and train with Duke Manyweather, arguably the best offensive private offensive line coach in the league, and he's putting in the work, right? Like he knows that this is the make or break season, and he's doing everything in his power to make sure that he is able to take advantage of that situation. So for me, like that's a positive sign in of itself.
Yeah, we're gonna kind of learn when the rubber meets the road whether or not Trey Pipkins is truly improved. But I think just in general, we've done several like off-season, this guy's gonna break out candidates. Last year, unfortunately, it was Jerry Tillery for many people, and then we didn't see that pan out in a significant way. And it's been Trey Pipkins before as well. But I think the difference that you've seen from Daniel Popper's piece that he wrote from The Athletic, or even how Duke has talked about Trey, is that they've talked about like specific things that he's honed in on from his movement, even to how he uses a gluteal muscle in the Daniel Popper article. And when you get to like real refined technique things like that, I'm not that I'm some OL mastermind myself, but I think that grabs your attention more than, oh, he's in the weight room, or, oh, he's doing this, right? I think they're really trying to hone in on some of the things that Trey has struggled with to this point in his career, so that he can be the prospect that he was kind of promised to be, right, in the third round all those years ago when Tom Telesco took him. So I think it's worth noting all of these things as well, because now he's working with Duke Manyweather and working on with all these national NFL offensive linemen. I don't know what he was doing the first 3 years, but it wasn't quite that. So I mean, being in this national program and being on that regimen is different than obviously coming out of Sioux Falls and not getting as much playing time those first few years when he was in the league compared to what the last two have been. So for me, I buy stock up on Trey Pipkins, and it's also a byproduct of what else they have on the roster, right? Are we going to run back another year of Storm Norton? I'd rather see what I have in Trey Pipkins. We kind of know what Storm Norton is at this point, which is a serviceable, tackle, but not anything more than that. So the fact that you could get potentially more upside with Trey is where I think the value is, and I do buy stock up from that standpoint.
Yeah, that's been my biggest thing from the jump here, is that if they like Trey a lot, that's fantastic. I would really like to see him earn, that chance to start with a legitimate competition. And I don't really know how much I buy into a Trey Pipkins versus Storm Norton competition, meaning that Trey has really earned the chance to start. I think if he were beating out, somebody like a Dennis Kelly or a Riley Reef or somebody like that, I mean, Darrell Williams for sake of our argument. I think there's a big difference between beating out somebody who's a viable right tackle and not somebody who was the second worst right tackle in the league last year, according to total pressures allowed and pass blocking efficiency rating. So I that's been my biggest thing, right? Is I just wish that they would have done a better job getting an insurance policy. Because what happens if Trey, gets against Khalil Mack a couple times, gets worked, and then his confidence is completely gone? You know what I mean? So at that point, you're just kind of screwed. So I just wish they would have done a better job providing a legitimate insurance policy and competition for Trey / Storm at this point.
Yeah, 100%. After watching 14 games now, I was, by the way, loving watching the Kansas City loss 2 times in a row. That's been really fun. But I mean, watching the games, it was it's so obvious that the idea of a wide receiver 3 deep threat being the missing piece, no, right tackle for sure. So your frustrations, I mean, yeah, I'm frustrated too that they didn't go out and get a real insurance policy. Even if you believe in Trey Pipkins, that's all in on Trey Pipkins is quite a statement.
Yeah. And we've, this offseason, right, we've heard that they're still very high on Kenneth Murray, but they still go out and sign a Troy Reader kind of player for insurance. They're very high in Chris Rumph, but they still go out and sign a Kyle Van Noy for insurance and competition. I wish they would have employed the same strategy for right tackle. And again, it's fantastic that Trey is taking these steps and doing everything possible. Like I said, Thomas Martinez pointing out in the chat, and he moved his family down to Dallas as well to make sure that he could just be all in on training with Duke. And I think that's great. We've seen other players who are on the hot seat not necessarily take their off-season training super seriously, and Trey is doing that. So for me, that's the biggest positive here, is that Trey is doing everything possible to secure that spot, and good for him, man. If he's able to secure that, and if he's able to be that average right tackle, I think that's a huge win for the Chargers. So wrapping it up here on Trey, here's what I'll say in terms of like expectations, right? So obviously he only had he had 2 starts last year, and in those 2 starts he allowed 3 total pressures, which is only 1.5 per game and a 25-17 game pace. I think that is a wholly unrealistic expectation for Trey Pipkins if he is able to start. In 2020, he started 9 games. He allowed 27 total pressures, which is 3 per game, and 51-17 game pace, which would be an improvement over Storm Norton's 2021 performance. So if he could just kind of bridge that gap between what we're seeing in a 1.5 per game or 1.5 per game average versus a 3 per game average, that would put him somewhere in like the Eric Fisher, Donovan Smith range in terms of total pressures allowed. And to me, that's a win. Like that's a huge win if we can get 40 total pressures allowed from Trey Pipkins. I think that would be like the absolute ceiling where I would take, as opposed to like expecting him to be like a huge breakout, like top 15 tackle or something like that.
I just wanted to say shout out to Tyler for actually going back through and watching all these games. I saw him that he was rewatching the Texans game today, and I just had a heart attack by proxy. So, I mean, shout out to Tyler for doing that.
Appreciate that. All this for something that I think got like 800 views on my first video. So, I can't wait to keep pushing through for that. But
the algorithm's not friendly right now.
Yeah, this one, Truza Compapa, is just kind of same question, same general idea. Where would Trey have to rank among the 32 right tackles for you to feel like he made a good enough stride? The Chargers don't have to draft or sign anyone. Are we talking about into 2023? Because he's not back. Like, I don't think he's back, regardless of his performance, unless he can get away with like $1 million contract. The Chargers are kind of screwed for money right now. But in terms of having not drafted or signed a right tackle, what would he have to be to justify that? 24th. I mean, 28th. 27th. That's better than 32nd, isn't it?
So I almost feel like it's the same conversation of when we talked about special teams last year, where it's just like, just don't be terrible. Like if you give us top 25 performance, then at that point you're probably worth the league minimum contract. But if you're a top 33 right tackle, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if you look around the league, right tackle is not a star-studded position by any means. I'll just kind of list the starting right tackles as projected by our lads. Spencer Brown for the Bills, Austin Jackson for the Dolphins, Trent Brown for the Patriots, Mekhi Becton for the Jets, Morgan Moses for the Ravens, La'el Collins for the Bengals, Jack Conklin, who's really good, for the Browns, Chukwuma Okorafor, Braden Smith for the Colts, who's really good, Jawan Taylor for the Jaguars, who I talked about as like a potential trade candidate, Dylan Radins or Nicholas Petit-Frere for the Titans, Billy Turner for the Broncos, Andrew Wiley for the Chiefs, Alex Leatherwood for the Raiders. Our lads does have Trey Pipkins as a projected starter for what it's worth. Terrence Steele for the Cowboys, Evan Neal for the Giants, Lane Johnson for the Eagles, who's a freaking monster, Sam Cosmi for Washington, who's pretty good, Larry Borum for the Bears, Penei Sewell for the Lions, Elton Jenkins for the Packers, who's amazing, Ryan O'Neal for the Vikings, who's really good, Caleb McGarry, Taylor Moton, who's really good, Ryan Ramczyk, who's really good, Tristan Wirfs, who obviously is like one of the best offensive tackles in the league, Kelvin Beachum, Rob Havenstein, Mike McGlinchey for the Niners, and then Jake Curran for the Seahawks. So it's not a great position overall. Like there's 2 elite guys and then 3 or 4 like really good players. So if he's serviceable, then he could pretty easily be like a top 20 right tackle, which would be again a huge win for the Chargers.
Yeah, and in general, it should be a pretty tackle favored kind of scheme. I mean, they're not going to do these Lynn, 15-step dropbacks on 3rd and 82 like Penei Sewell had to deal with. Like a lot of RPOs, they're going to run the ball more. Herbert should be more mobile, more bootlegs or whatever. So like it should be also a very good system for Pipkins as well.
Yeah.
Then again, absolutely. They also had Storm Norton. He was one of the worst tackles in the league. So maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, they also feel like if you solve the right guard spot, then it would be easier. And I think, Ode Ibushi did really help out Storm Norton quite a bit in those 3.5 games or I guess, was it 4.5? 3.5?
4.5.
4.5. Okay. So I don't know. We'll see how much that is actually a thing. So, Tyler, did you have a stock up, stock down that you wanted to mention here?
I mean, that was obviously the big one. I do want to talk about it's such a minor thing, but I think I mean, he has to be stock up to make the team. It's Dean Leonard, and that's like 3 pass breakups on Easton Stick isn't the greatest achievement in the world. It's not going to win you the Medal of Honor by any means or Defensive Player of the Year, but I mean, this guy needed to start performing very early and show that he was worth a roster spot. Like as it is right now, even drafted, he's on the roster bubble. I think even Daniel Popper had him not making the team, but you know, his biggest thing, and Staley said as much, like there were traits that he had that they knew that they could develop, they wanted to develop. And to me on film, that was pretty clearly his ability to turn his head around and, you know, break up a pass. And so him to break up 3 passes in one day on Easton Stick, that's big. Is this a big name? No. Could we be talking about corners? Sure. Or like Asante Samuel Jr. Michael Davis corners? Sure. But I think that's significant for Dean Leonard. I still don't know if he makes the team, but if you go out and you show out, and even the play that he, you know, Palmer beat him for that touchdown, I believe, is in really good position. So I think that him starting off really hot so far is stock up for him. We'll see if he makes the team.
Yeah, I think you have to consider him stock up for now. We'll see what kind of happens there. I think Ja'Sir Taylor, obviously a little bit more secure in making the team because I feel like just his special teams ability. You're competing with Keemon Hall for that kind of last slot spot, which I don't think is necessarily the same thing. But Dean Leonard, if he's going to make the team, probably has to beat out Tavon Campbell, who I know he has a lot of heat on Chargers Twitter and things like that. And I'm not saying he's a great player by any means, but we've seen him play some good football, you know, at least serviceable football for the Chargers over the last 2 years. So I think he's a bit of a long shot, but if he's breaking up passes at this kind of level, then I think you have to consider keeping him and developing your draft pick as opposed to the 31-year-old former CFL player who has only been on your team for 2 years.
Yep.
All right, Alex, did you have one you wanted to mention here?
I don't really know if I have like a stock up, stock down candidate in traditional sense, but I'll just say compared to what the wide receiver situation was in training camp last year, where, you know, obviously we had the whole Tyron Johnson fiasco, but it felt like what you were going to do for wide receivers 4 to 6 was pretty uncertain last year. So I'm going to say the fact that we know who our 5 receivers are pretty much heading into the season is stock up for both Jalen Guyton and Josh Palmer. Compared to where they were last season. Obviously, Jalen Guyton finished the season strong. Josh Palmer's received nothing but love from the coaches, from Justin Herbert himself in these press conferences. So I think you have both guys who had good production last year, both over 30 receptions. The fact that, you know, potentially probably you don't have the space in the offense for them to both be 50 catch kind of guys. But the fact that we're even like talking about that possibility or them both being 40 reception type players, I think speaks to where Jalen Guyton got better last year and where Josh Palmer started to fit in the offense towards the end of the year. The chemistry they both have with Justin Herbert. And so the fact that the Chargers are clearly not looking for a 6 receiver and, you know, having to scramble down the depth chart to find someone, I think is a real credit to what both of them did at wide receiver towards the end of last year with Guyton's bump and Palmer's development.
Yeah, Tyler, you've been obviously watching the receivers specifically, and you've been focusing on Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, but you've talked a little bit on Twitter about what you've seen from Josh Palmer on film. Do you think this really is like a competition for wide receiver 3, or is this, you know, this is really Palmer's job to lose, if you will?
That's really tough because like Palmer's the guy you want to develop, and like obviously Mike Williams at this point is the better wide receiver, I think, or can produce. But Josh Palmer, like, I'm not entirely convinced he can't just replicate Mike Williams' stats tomorrow. He's so good. And Laurie Fitzpatrick did a great breakdown of him as is. And just watching him, I'm not watching Josh Palmer. But outside of Austin Eckler, who, you know, touches the ball 300 times or whatever, Josh Palmer just stands out over and over again. He's so good. And there's just an explosiveness and a youthfulness to him that the other guys just really don't have. You know, Mike Williams at some point was just on one bad knee, and Keenan Allen's never been really quick, and he's 30. There's Josh Palmer. Just, you watch sometimes him and another receiver like Williams run parallel routes, and one guy's just doing it a little bit quicker, a little bit better than the other one, and that's Josh Palmer. Do I think it's a real battle? Yeah, I do, because I think that, well, okay, Guyton is the one playing gunner for special teams. It sounds like that's his role, which you could say is stock up, because that means like, yeah, he's got a great defined role. At the same time, if you're the guy playing special teams, are you really the wide receiver 3? Is it going to be Josh Palmer? I do think Guyton probably should still be wide receiver 3 because he does something differently. And because I do think he has earned the spot, and Palmer hasn't really, like, there's no real big difference between those two guys. But man, like, I would love to see Palmer win wide receiver 3 because he's so freaking good. Like, I do think he is Mike Williams' replacement in 2 years.
Yeah, Arjun had a great point today about contracts, and he specifically was talking about 5-year contracts. But I think in general, the wide majority of NFL contracts don't really reach their full completion status, if you will, whether it's a 3 or 4 or 5-year deal. So it's a really interesting thing, right? Like, I haven't watched as much as you have this offseason about the wide receiver position, but I think Josh Palmer 100% gets more targets and receptions than Jalen Guyton will. But I still think, like you do, that you still have to give Jalen Guyton a role because of his speed and because he opens things up. And I will say that, Jalen Guyton to me gets too much hate on Chargers Twitter. I don't think he's necessarily a great player, but we've seen him improve every single year that he's been on the team. And now he's potentially taking on a larger role on special teams. So I think it would be stock up for both of those players this year, because I just think like the offense is going to be overall better and more efficient with, the second year. But I'm very curious to see how that one plays out in training camp.
Yeah, and I think another big thing is the Chargers just decided to not add a wide receiver, right, in the draft. That was a big thing we did during our mock drafts, was either they take one like the third round, they take one maybe later on day 3. Never did, right? So, I mean, I think that tells you what they feel about them. As far as Josh Palmer being the potential Mike Williams replacement, I mean, I think we've seen Tom Telesco give out those 3-year contracts that are really 2-year contracts quite often. Mike Williams is $40 million guaranteed, I think, on the nose, out of his $60 million. So it is basically a 2-year deal, and we saw that with Brian Bulaga cut in the last year. And we've also speculated that about Michael Davis's contract, which is a 3-year deal, and then they can save $7 million if they cut him next year. So Tom Telesco has kind of been the king of those deals.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, definitely something to keep an eye on there in training camp. So the last one that I wanted to talk about here is there was a great story on Chargers.com, a great conversation with Nasir Adderley, and we didn't really talk about this because I was on a break at that point, but Brandon Staley did mention him as one of the most productive guys in the secondary and on the team in general. And he said that he came in great shape. He's very sharp physically, mentally, had a very high quality spring. And so I've been focusing in on the defensive front, specifically Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack recently, but Nasir Adderley is constantly popping on tape specifically as a run defender. So I think there are definitely some things that Nasir Adderley needs to correct when it comes to coverage, when it comes to making plays on the ball. That is something that he also talked about in this conversation, that he played all of last season essentially with a broken finger, which he felt like really limited his ability to take the ball away, which, if you've ever played football, you know how hard it is to catch a football with a broken finger on one of your hands. So it is something to take into consideration, but I think we saw a mini breakout from Nasir Adderley last year. Again, would have loved to see more interceptions and things like that, more pass breakups. But the way that he was playing as a run defender last year was so much fun to watch. And he is constantly, just showing off his range, showing off his athleticism, and making plays. Like, there was a couple plays that he had against Nick Chubb where he came from the top of the 2-high shell and just laid him out right in the hole. And he did it against Clyde Edwards-Helaire as well. He's making great plays in space. And so I went and looked today at PFF, and Nas actually had more run stops and a higher run stop percentage than Derwin James did last year, which I think would surprise a lot of people. just based off of what they think of those two players. And Derwin James obviously is in the box a lot more than Nasir Adderley is. So definitely something to keep an eye on. I'm definitely not saying that Adderley is a better run defender than Derwin James, but I think we saw him take legitimate steps forward in that regard. So if he can, fix some of the missed tackle rate. So that's another thing that I looked at. His missed tackle rate against the run was fine. It was only 13%. It was a better number than guys like Malcolm Jenkins, John Johnson III, Jesse Bates, Quandre Diggs, Tyrann Mathieu, Antoine Winfield, Mike Hyde, Darnell Savage, were players all higher on the list than him in missed tackle rate. The problem is that he had a let me make sure I get this number right. His missed tackle rate against the pass was 20%, and that was the 5th highest rate. So against the run, the missed tackles are not necessarily as big of an issue. It's against the pass where he's kind of making those mistakes, and that maybe some of that is scheme, maybe some of that is the finger. I don't really know, but I think if we can get Nasir Adderley to take another minor leap forward, we could be talking about a top 15 to 20 safety in the league, and I think that's a huge win again for the Chargers. Just getting in more solid players on defense.
Yeah, I would love to see it. I mean, we talk about Jalen Guyton taking another step forward, and he has, but he started from a place of being kind of irrelevant and an awful catcher to being a nice, solid wide receiver 3. Nasir Adderley started as a very good prospect, and he's slowly worked himself and just improving every year. And so, yeah, I mean, I really do think it is stock up for him. Maybe even if camp hasn't been stock up for him, I think heading into the season, he's got so much momentum. He is in that second year. And like you said, he's attacking downhill. As a guy who's kind of struggled with injuries for the Chargers. And if he's just feeling that confident now and knows his place and his responsibilities, and heck, everybody in front of him is better too. I think he's gonna have a great year. And then we're not going to re-sign him.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's probably the situation with Nas. I'll be curious to see what, again, they think of JT Woods this year, right? Obviously spent their second highest draft pick on a safety. So, that is kind of a Brandon Staley feature of the defense, and obviously just how much they value JT Woods. But I'll be curious to see as the season goes on what Nasir Adderley's level of play is and what's the trend in terms of JT Woods snaps throughout the season. So I think that is something to monitor if we're talking about a stock up, stock down, breakout type year.
Yeah, again, watching that defense and watching the players along the defensive line just really hanging out their linebackers and safeties to dry. There was so much stress on Derwin James, Nasir Adderley, and Kaiser White, Drew Tranquil on a week-to-week basis. It was really hard to watch the first few games, and then I haven't gotten to it yet, but eventually they kind of did figure out a little bit throughout the middle of the season. But those first 5 games that I've watched were ugly. The Browns game in particular was a total buzzsaw situation. Like Joel Bitonio, Wyatt Teller, JC Treader just destroyed that defensive front, and they didn't have Jedrick Wills, and it was just like Nick Chubb was not getting touched for like 5 yards a pop, and then he's also Nick Chubb in space. So it was rough. And again, Nas, Derwin, and the safeties in general were just in such a tough position. But I feel like Nas really did take a step forward as a run defender. And now if we can get him to take a step forward as a coverage defender, as a free safety, deep specialist, then I think we have a really good player on our hands.
Yep, absolutely. Any stock down guys for you guys?
I'll bring up an interesting one. Donald Parham stock down. So, we sort of went into last year talking about him potentially being like a quasi tight end 1, tight end 2 with Jared Cook. And it never really happened, right? Obviously, I think production for the whole season, he ended up having about 190 yards. Had some important touchdown catches as well. Unfortunately, gets the terrible concussion at in the Kansas City game. But just throughout the season, it was very clear that he was a pretty distant tight end 2, right? It never really felt like he was near what Jared Cook's usage was. And unfortunately, Jared Cook's usage was a little bit too high at times. But the Chargers this offseason, we've heard the buzz about, Stone Smart, potentially in their mini camp, Hunter Kampmoyer as like guys that are a little bit behind Donald Parham on the depth chart, obviously distant from him as well. But we've heard positive things about them. Parham spent a decent portion of this offseason unable to train, unable to take part in football drills. So, that is a way that he is a little bit behind the 8 ball. And then, you talk about what the Chargers did in free agency. Obviously in 2020, spending a top 100 pick on Trey McKitty, then go to free agency this year. We were sort of talking about some of the tight ends they could sign, and they signed Gerald Everett to a 2-year deal. And I think it's notable that it is a real, 2-year deal in terms of how that contract is constructed. They want him for at least until 2024. And so that, to me, for Donald Parham, who is a restricted free agent next year, they don't have his IRFA rights anymore. So he is not going to cost the league minimum, to get back. Obviously, that kind of depends on his season, but they don't have his IRFA rights, so they won't have him at the automatic league minimum. That kind of tells you a little bit what they think, because we've always kind of talked about Parham as like, okay, maybe after Cook, he'll elevate to tight end 1. Maybe after this year, he'll start to really take that step forward. And it really feels like we've seen step neutral to this point. And based on the Chargers' actions to this point in signing Gerald Everett to a longer-term deal than I sort of expected at the time, I think that it is kind of stock down for Donald Parham in terms of being a tight end 2, and also probably not being in this team's long-term plans as we felt like at one point he might have been.
Yeah, agree there. Guy who should be involved more. I don't think I could put him in the stock down category, but he's certainly a stock flat. Like there's nothing, there's no ceiling. It feels like, unless somebody gets hurt, he's just like, he'll play, he'll get his targets, he'll get some touchdowns, and they'll probably just move on. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the way it seems to be going with Parham. They've never figured out how to get him truly involved in a high volume.
Right.
I mean, maybe that changes, I guess, but I just don't really see it when you sign someone like Everett.
Yeah, I don't think it's a stock down relative to being tight end 2. Like, of course, he's still going to be that. Yeah. But compared to being tight end 1 and what we thought he could have been, or what was supposed to be, certainly at the end of 2020, and what the expectations were going into last year, and what they kind of are going into this year, definitely think it's been a downward adjustment, you could say.
No, I definitely see what Alex is saying, and I do agree. Like long term, he is a stock down. I mean, Trey McKitty presumably takes a step forward this year as a pass catcher. I really was a big fan of what he did as a run blocker down the stretch. So next year you're probably looking at Everett and McKitty being 1 and 2, and I just obviously depends how much Parham produces, right? But I can't imagine them being able to give him a bigger contract when you're talking about all of the other needs that they'll have and very limited cap space. So I think, Everett and McKitty, I feel good about that group. Maybe they draft somebody else next year in the 3rd, 4th round. I did see a 2023 mock draft where they took the Notre Dame tight end in the 1st round. That would be amazing. That'd be so much fun. But I'm hoping for the best. I hope I hope Parham, has a great season, but it's just tough for me to look at his long-term future and think, yeah, this is a guy who's absolutely going to be on the team 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Minor stock down, I guess I've kind of talked about this. Christian Covington, I want no part of having him on the team this year. I want Braden Foko so much more on this team. I think there's obviously, if everybody stays healthy, I think the Chargers' interior defensive line is going to be much improved, right? Specifically against the run with Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph-Day. I think Morgan Fox is a fine run defender. We'll see about Tito and what he's able to do. But if Sebastian Joseph-Day or Austin Johnson get hurt and they have to start Christian Covington, the run defense is not going to be improved. It might be worse, depending on really what they do from an interior defensive line standpoint. So I just would feel much better about being able to have Sebastian Joseph-Day and Braden Fehoko if Austin Johnson misses games, or Austin Johnson and Braden Fehoko if Sebastian Joseph misses games. Christian Covington, not good. Don't want him on the team. I'm sorry. He seems like a great dude, but he's, after watching last season, major stock down so far for him.
That's a shame. I don't recall the film as much. And I certainly won't watch interior film, so I'll take your word for it. But it's always funny the way that one of them is a former 1st round pick and one of them is the true starter. But like Covington's run stop rate's like 5 spots from Tillery's. Like he just is slightly.
Yeah.
It was almost like we forget about Covington because Tillery is so bad, but Covington's like right there, like they're right next to each other.
No, like
and, I'm
it's
sure it looks like that on film.
Yeah, it's very similar where every once in a while Jerry Tillery will pop and you're like, oh, there's that first round pick. And then the rest of the game is bad. Covington's the same way. He just doesn't have the first round tag. It's like, oh, that was a really good grab, Christian Covington. And then like 3 plays later, you're like, oh, you're 8 yards in Drew Tranquil's lap. Okay, what is happening here? So it's just tough for me to like think about some potential injury happening and looking at Christian Covington and being like, yeah, this guy, he's a capable backup. He should absolutely be able to hold down the fort, when he did not do that last year. And again, there was several other injuries. You're dealing with Linval Joseph potential decline and stuff like that. But I just don't feel comfortable in a potential world where if Sebastian Joseph Day pulls a hammy and misses 4 games, that Christian Covington has to start.
Yeah. I watched we all watched the Eagles game, but I've had a couple Eagles fans friends who watched film of the Eagles games and also texted me, who's 99 on your team? Who's 95 on your team? Because that is not a banner game for either Covington or Tillery. Granted, Eagles offensive line and all that, and then they're one of the best units in the league, but that one was certainly a struggle for them. And Christian Covington shows his flashes at times, but you just don't see it quite as often, and it really is a problem. I think when you had the group the Chargers did last year, hopefully he's a little bit better with getting to play with SG Day, getting to play with Austin Johnson. I just don't see the value in it at this point. Then again, he's on a minimum contract, so you're not getting a whole you're not asking for a whole lot out of him, I guess.
Yeah, so that's my last one. I had to get that one off my chest. It's just been lousy to watch the first few games of a run defense that featured Eric Banks, Christian Covington, and Jerry Tillery as your 3 key players at certain points. So
I'll talk about a stock down in the sense of, I'll ask it as a question. We know Isaiah Spiller's basically RB2. If you had to guess who's more stock down, would you say that it's Larry Roundtree or would you say it's Joshua Kelly?
I think it's Kelly.
I mean, if I'm basing it off of like skill set, like, okay, who is Isaiah Spiller more like? Which sounds shitty. But like, I think Kelly is a bit more of a pass catcher, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, Roundtree certainly isn't. Whereas Roundtree's more like I think what they want is as a contact, grind out the yards kind of guy. So I suppose Kelly, based on that, is stocked down, but Roundtree is still the guy who didn't play since the Steelers game, or on offense, that is. So I think it's kind of like Kelly is the RB3, but he's kind of stocked down because Spiller has a skill set that's more like his.
If Joshua Kelly could hold on to the ball, I'd be fine with him as RB3.
Sure.
Like, I think he just gives you a little bit of a different skill set among those 3. And that's a good, like, physically, it's a good balance between those 3. But this regime drafted Larry Roundtree. Yeah. They made the decision to put him as a kick returner. So, I mean, obviously they like some aspects of his game. And I will say that he's a much better pass protector than Joshua Kelly, which is maybe another feather in his cap. But again, Tyler pointed out that Joshua Kelly was having all these issues and not necessarily making the right decisions on special teams, and they still chose they still chose to play him over Larry Roundtree for the back half of the season. So it's a very strange dynamic that, like, connecting the dots would lead you towards Roundtree being that guy, but then Kelly was the one who was playing down the stretch. So just somebody be not terrible, please.
Once again, petitioning for like a top 10 per play back in Justin Jackson, but
yes,
I guess he's unrosterable according to half of Twitter. So you're gonna get what you get.
Yeah. Mark Matlock pointing in a veteran running back addition. Maybe if somebody really interesting gets cut, cut in training camp, I could see them maybe making, a waiver claim there. There are some pretty crowded backfields, around the league that I would be keeping an eye on there. But I think then you're getting into like, well, Larry Roundtree, Joshua Kelly know our scheme. They know our culture. They've been in the room. They've been in the building. Whereas you're bringing in an outside player who maybe doesn't necessarily know those things as well.
Yeah, I mean, if they know how to run the football, that would be great.
They know how to catch the football.
Yeah, either of those things would be awesome. Yeah, I mean, there are veteran running backs out there. Like, it's not.
Yeah, Brandon Staley said they didn't really like the running back free agent market. That could have been more of like we didn't want to invest, like high end money in like a true RB2, which is why they drafted Spiller. But I guess if they get through like the first couple of weeks of training camp, preseason, and Kelly Roundtree are still kind of having the same problems, then maybe I think you could see them bringing in. I don't even know who's available off the top of my head, but I think you'd have to see them. Neither of them like take a step forward at all for them to bring in somebody else.
Yep, we'll see what Ficken decides.
That is also a possibility, which I think kind of could give Kevin Marks an edge. Really fantastic blocker from what I saw on film. So we'll see. All right, Tyler, Alex, any final thoughts before we head out for the evening here?
Nah, man, just happy to be inching closer to the Chargers actually playing football.
Yeah. Shout out to Gilbert Manzano. Obviously has written his last piece with the Chargers, going across the locker room to the Rams, so he's not going too far. But he's been on this show a couple times, so just wanted to thank him for that and his time with the team.
Yeah, absolutely. He's been very gracious with his time with us, and wish him nothing but the best covering the other team. So the Chargers beat going through some changes. Hopefully they get some new blood in there and some fresh ideas to balance out with Daniel Popper, who is kind of carrying that load right now. So that's going to do it for us today, guys. Appreciate all of the super chats. Appreciate all of the commentary in the chat today. As always, if you are listening to this, please leave a rating or review on the podcast platform of your choice. We do really appreciate all that positive feedback. We'll see you next time for our next episode, and we'll talk to you then.